The taping. There it is. Got it. I'm happy to introduce Alex Taylor, the inaugural recipient of the Jean M. and William C. Laidlaw Junior Scholar Fellowship. Taylor is clearly a scholar who is making the most of the Flannery O'Connor collection here at Georgia College. Back in 2020, Taylor entered the Sarah Gordon Award competition sponsored by the Flannery O'Connor Review, and he won the award with an article entitled, "Listen Here, Sabbath Lily Hawks's Prophetic Tales in Flannery O'Connor's Wise Blood." His award-winning article was published in the 2021 volume of the Flannery O'Connor Review, and I'm still selling copies of that, folks. Taylor was then and is now a graduate student at the University of Dallas, where he was for a time a Cowan Fellow for Criticism, and he is completing an interdisciplinary dissertation called, well, it was when I wrote the bio. When I wrote this introduction, maybe it's changed since then. Unreal Cities, the Political Vision of Evelyn, Waugh, and Flannery O'Connor. In June 2023, Taylor was a participant in Reconsidering Flannery O'Connor, our NEH Summer Institute, that is basically a month-long boot camp for teachers wanting to get more serious about the works of O'Connor. Thank you, National Endowment for the Humanities, for that ever so helpful grant. Alex Taylor is now an assistant professor of English language and literature at Christendom College, a Catholic liberal arts college in Front Royal, Virginia. He has published criticism in Logos, a journal of Catholic thought and culture, in the James Dickey Review, and of course, in the Flannery O'Connor Review. He also writes poetry and other essays, and he publishes reviews of fiction, nonfiction, and film. Take it away, Alex.
Well, thank you so much, Bruce, for that introduction. And of course, to Katie and Jess for all the work you've done behind the scenes to make this lecture happen. I wanted to give a special thanks also to the Laidlaw family for endowing this fellowship. It was a real blessing to be able to read the Wise Blood manuscript with such attention. And I'm truly grateful for the financial support which made that possible. My dissertation project examines how two Catholic authors, Evelyn Waugh and Flannery O'Connor, present in two novels a vision of modern political life, which shows the unreality of the modern city caused by the corruption of the foundations and the purpose of the city generally, namely marriage, family, and religion. Before I get into the argument of the dissertation itself and discuss the recent research that I did in Milledgeville, I wanted to elaborate a bit on the question that my dissertation seeks to answer, as well as how I discovered that question, so I think my path to inquiry is a bit different from many others working on O'Connor today. It was back in the fall of 2019 when I was in Father Robert McGuire's Modern Southern Literature class at the University of Dallas. I knew at that time that I wanted to write on O'Connor's first novel, Wise Blood, because I'd been interested in her work for about 7 years at that point, and we were reading that novel in the course. Many scholars of O'Connor's fiction, even if they have not spent much time with the novel, will be familiar with its plot, which I'll just very briefly summarize. The novel presents to its readers the journey of Hazel Motes, a young 22-year-old Army veteran who has recently returned stateside from fighting abroad in World War II. Motes turns to the fictitious city of Tockenham in a religious quest to deny his sense of sin, inherited from his mother and grandfather's Christianity, by taking up with a prostitute and eventually becoming a preacher of blasphemy, the founding pastor of what eventually comes to be known as the Church Without Christ. Hayes preaches outside the movie theaters, but is given little attention by the bystanders of Tockenham, who were indifferent to religion, even Hayes's nihilism. He ends up pursuing an apparently blind street preacher, Asa Hawks, who supposedly has blinded himself as a testament to his faith, and his 15-year-old daughter, Sabbath, torn by conflicting desires. On the one hand, to have Asa preach to him, and on the other hand, to seduce Sabbath to show Asa, and presumably God, whom Hayes thinks Asa serves, that he doesn't believe in sin. Meanwhile, Hayes is being pursued by an unwanted disciple, an 18-year-old boy named Enoch Emery, who works at the park at the heart of the city and is desperately searching for friendship. After a run-in with a man with the stage name Ani J. Holy, who wants to commercialize the Church Without Christ, Hayes encounters Ani J with a man he has hired to play a look-alike of Hayes. Hayes is driven to murder the man, Solace Layfield, with his car, and after a series of other events, attempts to leave the city of Tottenham to seek another city to preach his church in. However, he's thwarted by a police officer who has Hayes drive up onto a bluff, and then, after Hayes has stepped out of the car, pushes the car down the hill. Hayes then walks several miles back to his boarding house before blinding himself, and the final chapter shows him living in penitence for the sins he now accepts that he has committed. There's much more to the novel than this outline, of course, but in recent years, the novel has received little critical discussion. It appears that the lines of a major dispute concerning how we should interpret the novel's plot, namely whether Hayes's self-blinding was in fact an act of conversion and penance, or one of self-torture committed out of a failure of Christian imagination, had been set by a symposium guest edited in the O'Connor Review by Susan Srigley, featuring essays by herself, Ralph Wood, and Brian Ingraffia. In the 10 years between that publication and when I first began writing seriously about the novel in 2019, little work had been done on the novel, and that which had been written did not typically concern itself with the novel as such, but in examining its relationship to the film adaptation by John Huston, or in taking images from the novel as a springboard to some topical discussion of interest to the author. I had an intuition there was much more to be understood about the novel itself, how O'Connor's Catholic imagination had crafted an intricate form, typically less appreciated than her short stories, though unjustly, I thought and still think. I focused at first on chapter 7 of Wise Blood, where Sabbath Hawks hides in Hayes's car as he attempts to have a pleasant day in the countryside, and ended up writing a longer article analyzing Sabbath's prophetic storytelling, which was published in the 2021 edition of the O'Connor Review. At about the same time as I was writing that essay, I realized that there was a particularly curious, ambiguous statement Hayes utters right before he disappears from the novel's gaze and its second action ends. After his self-blinding and sometime living in a boarding house owned and operated by Mrs. Flood, Hayes seeks to leave the house. Mrs. Flood has grown fascinated with Hayes, aware that he knows something that she doesn't, and ends up proposing marriage. Hayes simply disregards this offer and turns to leave the house, heading down its stairs. To quote, in a voice getting higher, Mrs. Flood asks him, "Or were you planning to find you another rooming house? Maybe you were planning to go to some other city." Hayes then speaks his penultimate words of the novel, a cryptic remark. "That's not where I'm going. There's no other house, nor no other city." On a literal level, the statement is simply false. We know that Tottenham has other houses, and the novel opens with Hayes on a train. And in that chapter, several other cities or towns are named, such as Melzi, East Rod, Tula Falls, or Chicago. So what does Hayes mean here? What does it mean for Hayes at this moment of the novel to speak these words, in a novel in which the city seems to be a thematic concern? We remember that Enoch, a central foil for Hayes, proudly works for the city and has taken Hayes to the museum, pointedly described at the heart of the city, to show him a mystery, a shrunken and mummified man whom he later realizes is the new Jesus that Hayes has been preaching. But while remembering the importance of the city to this novel, I also was struck by a similarity in another novel, namely Evelyn Waugh's A Handful of Dust. O'Connor mentions having read Waugh in graduate school, mentioning a few of his novels by name or by character in her correspondence, particularly Vile Bodies, The Loved One, and Men at Arms, generalizing in such a way that suggests that she had read this novel, even before one sees this textual similarity. Despite O'Connor and Waugh's names being listed together almost any time someone composes a list of 20th century Catholic authors, I'm serious about this. You can Google like 20th century Catholic author, read almost any article that comes up, and they'll be right next to each other, or maybe one person in the middle on the list, right? There's been no serious comparative work on their fictions. Starting from the historical record, there's no correspondence between the two. They didn't know each other personally or write letters. And O'Connor's total remarks about Waugh make up less than half a page, such that scholars interested in comparative study of her work have had many other places to begin. But by missing the resonance to A Handful of Dust, we have missed the importance of the city as Wise Blood's central concern. The penultimate chapter of A Handful of Dust, named Du Côte du Chez Todd, finds the protagonist Tony Last stumbling into the camp of Mr. Todd, the chief of the local Pai Indians. Tony has recently left England in search of a city, as the previous chapter title has it, after his disillusionment, having learned of his wife's marital infidelity and worse to him, her willingness to deprive him of his beloved manor home, Hetton Abbey, as the price for a substantial marital alimony settlement. In the forests of Brazil, Tony's guide, Dr. Messenger, has gone over a waterfall, leaving alone malaria-stricken Tony, whose mind is for the moment stuck in a kind of fugue state, recapitulating images from his life in England. Upon his entry into the camp, Mr. Todd places Tony in a hammock and leaves to fetch medicinal herbs. At his return, he finds Tony in the middle of a speech to absent auditors. In that speech's peroration, Tony declares, "I will tell you what I have learned in the forest, where time is different. There is no city." What does this utterance mean? Is it a sign of Waugh's political pessimism? Or does it matter that he has it spoken by his protagonist, which a careful reading of the novel reveals to be a man akin to Friedrich Nietzsche's Last Man, Tony's last name, Last, possibly a pun on the concept. The similarity here between O'Connor and Waugh is not simply at the level of the statement, the difference between there is no other city and there is no city being only one word, but also at the level of the situation in both novels. Both claims take place at the end of the central character's final action, as Hayes dies not long after this statement, and Tony ends up trapped forever in Mr. Todd's encampment, a fate infernal or perhaps purgatorial, if he stands to learn something essential from his perpetual rereading of the novels of Charles Dickens. Neither novel is topically political, addressing contemporary policy issues or partisan politics. As O'Connor declared, the topical is poison. Rather, each presents a vision of the city as a modern wasteland, following the tradition of modernist city poetry, particularly T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland. This vision, when read in relation to the literary tradition implicated in the two novels, especially Thomas Mallory's Morte d'Arthur and Sophocles' Oedipus Rex and Oedipus Ecolaus, can help us see the political situation of the 20th century West more clearly, revealing problems endemic to not only the modern political order, but which tend to perennially threaten human flourishing. The theological and philosophical dimensions of O'Connor's work have long been recognized by scholars, but their political dimensions have recently begun to attract more attention. The essays in A Political Companion to Flannery O'Connor, published in 2017, run the gamut from historical investigations of O'Connor's relationship to the politics du jour to her intellectual connections with political thinkers such as Russell Kirk, Ivan Illich, and Eric Vogelin. Only two of these essays concentrate on a single story, and Wise Blood comes up only incidentally throughout the volume. Another recent monograph, Flannery O'Connor and the Perils of Governing by Tenderness by Jerome Foss, published in 2019, situates O'Connor's fiction within her reading of the history of political philosophy, especially as given articulation by Leo Strauss. Although in this study, Foss provides an interesting lens with which to read O'Connor's fiction, a literary reader might want to see more of reading happening in his argumentation, as too often the details of the story are missed for the story's larger political implications. Foss gives sustained attention to Wise Blood only in a concluding chapter, where he compares Hazel Motes to John Rawls, kind of curious comparison that. Prior essays on O'Connor and politics have tended in one of these two directions, namely either that of historicism on the one hand or political philosophy on the other. Ralph Wood and Henry Edmondson see O'Connor's fiction as political in both an Aristotelian and an Augustinian sense, a sense which I claim Waugh also shared. As Wood writes, citing Edmondson, "For O'Connor as for Aristotle, politics has little to do with electoral or diplomatic matters. Rather, it is the overarching discipline, the inquiry concerned with all areas of study having relevance to the virtuous life and with those matters that contribute to human flourishing." End quote. Although the fiction of both Waugh and O'Connor share in a kind of poetic refraction of this political inquiry, these two novels in particular, A Handful of Dust and Wise Blood, powerfully thematize the life of the city. These two novels show, in Rachel Levine's words, that aesthetic and political forms may be nested inside one another, and I aim to show that the form of the city and the form of these two novels are inextricably linked. However, the form of these novels' cities is one for which we need another guide than Aristotle to comprehend. Wood claims, and this is a longer quotation by Ralph Wood that I think is very, very much worth reading. Flannery O'Connor's politics were scandalously Augustinian because they set the earthly and heavenly cities in drastic opposition by their respective loves. In the former, declared Augustine, the lust for domination lords it over its princes, as over the nations it subjugates. And the other, both those put in authority and those subject to them serve one another in love. End quote. These two cities, for Augustine, as for O'Connor and Waugh, are not easily divided in this life, because membership in the city of God or the city of man is determined by the love which governs one's life. One can fall from the heavenly city just as one can rise on the wings of grace to the heavenly. Such a change of heart occurs not in isolation from politics, but in relation to other human beings and in relation to the God who governs the universe. The rest of my presentation will have three parts. First, I'll summarize briefly some of my research on A Handful of Dust, before turning to Wise Blood and the recent study I made of the manuscripts held in special collections in the Ina Dillard Russell Library in Milledgeville. I will then conclude seeking to explain the end of my title, summarizing the political vision of the novels. A Handful of Dust is a novel centered around the adultery of Tony Last's wife, Brenda, with a sponge, John Beaver, who does not work and whose main occupation is gossiping with his mother when he's not busy being London's most available man to fill up a lunch or dinner table should the need arise. An adultery novel can, of course, embody generally one of two moral positions. I know there's a lot else they can do, but just to simplify. Whether on the one hand, romanticizing the affair and trivializing the bond of marriage, or showing the tragedy of the infidelity, with the betrayed spouse acting as the wronged hero or heroine. Of these two options, Waugh's novel more resembles the latter, although Tony Last's position is not simply that of a guilty party. When I first began to work on this novel, I examined the ways in which Waugh, through careful use of Arthurian resonances with Thomas Mallory's Morte d'Arthur, the name of which is explicitly named in the novel, shows that although Brenda bears the most guilt for her conscious decision to pursue John Beaver, Tony is in subtle ways guilty of marital neglect, and through his inhospitality to Beaver, pushes his wife closer to the other man. Neglect is also the order of the day when it comes to how Brenda and Tony raise or fail to raise their young son, John Andrew, whose accidental death in the middle of the novel, on account of his parents' negligence and the greed of one of the townspeople near Hetton, ensures the end of Tony and Brenda's marriage. In examining the family life displayed within the novel and arguing that the corruption of the family life leads to the miseducation and even abuse and death of the child, the future of the city, I take a close look at how Waugh responds to Dickens, making John Andrew the most sympathetic character in the novel, even as he avoids Dickensian sentimentality. In the end, Waugh allows interaction with another child, Winnie, the daughter of an escort who accompanies Tony to the seaside to assist in providing evidence for his divorce case, to serve as a double for John Andrew, asking awkward questions, as Lobb puts it, which reveal the absurdity and duplicity in Ward's words of the adult world around them. Winnie's presence allows Tony to begin to see his own faults more clearly, such as his habit of lying, and he moves from not wanting her presence to being charitable to her, even when others do not understand his actions. For much of the novel, Waugh looks like a simple satirist, showing that if only husbands and wives attended to the good of their spouses and jointly cared for their children, society would not be falling apart. While this is certainly an aspect of Waugh's understanding of modern politics, he's no mere moralist, understanding that the larger problem of modernity is a loss of shared moral standards, without which satire is traditionally practiced is impossible. This is coming from an article he wrote in 1945 called Fanfare. In this novel, Waugh seeks to show that the ground beneath such societal foundations, namely the Christian religion as found in its perfect form in the Catholic Church, has been supplanted with dire consequences, the opening of an abyss beneath the social and political world of the novel, which threatens to swallow these civilized forms of human life into a barbarism that is already within the gates of Western society. Because Waugh, following in the wake of his friend Christopher Dawson, saw man as a religious animal fundamentally, he understood that the supplanting of Christianity in the city would not entail a wholly irreligious or atheistic society, but one whose religion was confused and perverted from its true end, namely the right worship of God. Without Christianity, human beings could live together, but only in social orders that prioritize the desires of adults over the needs of children, fame over goodness and moral virtue, and temporary pleasure over the sacrifices necessary to establish lasting homes. Even before the completion of Wise Blood in its published form, Flannery O'Connor was concerned with the same realities when considering the city and the home as Waugh. She saw both as clearly linked with her protagonist Hazel Motes, who, as she writes in an early synopsis of events to take place after chapters 1 to 4 of the novel, has a, quote, more immediate problem than the thought of God, namely, I quote, conquering the city. In this early projection of her character, O'Connor shows that Hayes's idea of conquering the city changes over time, from first becoming like Bill Hill, his sister's husband, who is a salesman for miracle products, then to following Sabbath and the paths of righteousness, feeling that he is regaining his childhood home of East Rod and capturing Tockenham at the same time. Once he and Sabbath have had an affair, however, in the manuscript drafts, she is the wife and not the child of Asa, he rejects the city completely and wants to find a place like East Rod. But when he has found one and begun agricultural work there, he discovers the values of Tockenham have penetrated the country, and he finds that he can't escape Tockenham or find East Rod no matter where he goes. There is no home for him unless God is a home, and he can't find God. He moves back to Tockenham in despair, hoping that Asa will see and kill him. A key difference between the two novels is that O'Connor's novel, even from its earliest draft, rejects outright a simply secular reading that fails to account for its character's religiosity. While the novel changes greatly from the manuscript drafts to the published edition, and I'll speak to how it changes in just a moment, O'Connor understood Hayes's motivations from very early on in her writing process. From the same synopsis, she writes the following. Hayes is motivated throughout by his search for a home. The events of the story should gradually impress on him the impossibility of his finding one. His search for a physical home mirrors his search for a spiritual one, and although he finds neither, it is the latter search, namely the search for a spiritual one, which saves him from becoming a member of the wasteland and makes him worth 75,000 words. You can tell perhaps by that kind of wittiness of the end, makes him worth 75,000 words, that she's writing this for a publisher. If Hayes's motivations remain constant from this early synopsis to the published novel, what else changes and why? It's worth pointing out that the manuscripts O'Connor left behind total some 1,700 odd pages for a novel which in its final edition would total 236. As is generally known, O'Connor's regular writing routine was to write for 3 hours a day without interruption. As I was looking over the manuscripts, I learned that her practice was to write and rewrite scenes with small variations until she was pleased with them, often handwriting edits over her typewritten pages before adding those changes to new typewritten pages along the way. While there are some scenes in the manuscript which are clearly the beginnings of parts of the final novel, there are many that never make it into the final edition, so much that I would argue that O'Connor fundamentally changed the novel after writing about 12 chapters. In the original manuscript, Hayes's family situation, and thus his entire life in Tockenham, is radically different. While in the published version, Hayes has 2 younger brothers, both deceased before he leaves for the war, in manuscript, O'Connor makes him part of a much larger family. In one early scene, the narrator tells us that he was his mother's last child, the 8th. His oldest 2 sisters are twin blondes, and the third is Ruby, who becomes the Ruby Hill of the story later published as A Stroke of Good Fortune. In drafts, O'Connor spends a great deal of time imagining family stories, whether Hayes's memory of Ruby taking him to Melzi as a child, imagining how he would fit into an Italian family he witnesses at a Chicago train station, and narratively recounting the settling in East Rod of the Dury family, who become the Parhams in the published novel. Much of the original edition revolves around Hayes meeting Ruby after he returns to the US after his military service. She has married Bill Hill, a salesman, and they live together at the top of a boarding house in Tockenham. Hayes comes to live with them and has a variety of adventures around the city, eating occasionally at the Palace restaurant, where he is served by an unnamed Greek man, having run-ins with either Leah or Leora Watts, the name kind of fluctuates, who lives in the same boarding house as his sister and who's trying to attract him, In different drafts, she either succeeds or fails to seduce him. The manuscript centers around family conflict, as Ruby wants to leave Eastrod and her mother's religious ways behind, but Hayes wants to connect with Ruby on the basis of shared childhood memories. When Ruby discovers she is pregnant and decides to take the mid-century equivalent of an abortion pill, Hayes represents the religious views of his mother, claiming that Ruby's decision is morally wrong and that she would be killing a person, his potential nephew, for whom he suggests a name and whom he sees as carrying on the family line. She herself is having doubts about whether she should try to get rid of the child, as we see in one of the instances in which O'Connor plays with stream of consciousness narration in the manuscript drafts. This is a quotation. "It was a person, somebody. She was trying to kill somebody. No, she was trying to make it go away. It was not a person. It was a thing, like a piece of fat with eyes. No, no." While O'Connor eventually excised this whole plot arc from the novel, keeping only the character Leora Watts, who has drastically changed and becomes much more of a cipher for the city at large rather than a distinct human character, what it helps us to see is that she did conceive of a possible novel in which family conflict was central, and in which that conflict was shown objectively. In the novel as published, rather, she shows that to Hayes subjectively, his family life plays a major role in the novel, but that in fact it is subordinated to a larger religious quest for meaning and vocation in the city to which he now turns, now empty of a family, though full of familial signifiers which point to less than friendly realities. By relating Hayes's family backstory only through his own consciousness, she additionally relativizes the historical truth of that story. We have access to Hayes's past and his family's religion only as he recalls it, as it has emotionally affected him. In the various incidents which have made lasting conscious impressions on his journey to and in Tockenham. In so doing, O'Connor presents a psychological interpretation of Hayes's journey parallel to his own understanding of his search, that he only wants to return home to Eastrod, but only in order to undermine the merely psychological, as a counterparry to psychologists like Freud's attack on religion. As can be seen in her prayer journal written during her time in Iowa, at the time which her idea for the novel began to germinate, O'Connor was sensitive to psychological explanations of religious phenomena, which attempted to reduce them to merely secular intercranial events. Her revised published scenes of Hayes's family life and what follows in the novel can be fruitfully read as a response to that sensitivity. In her MA thesis examining the character of Hayes's mother, Annie Lee Jackson, in the manuscript drafts, Catherine Boland argues that while O'Connor presents less of her character in the final version of the novel, her influence on Hayes remains a strong force in his quest and eventual failure to flee Jesus. I would suggest in a similar vein that numerous other traces remain from the manuscript in the final novel, as O'Connor redrafted it. Although O'Connor excised the plot relating to Ruby's child and possible abortion, the finished novel contains echoes of it in its presentation of the new Jesus, a shrunken man who is described in the finished novel as shriveled up, the same word used for the killing of the unborn child when Hayes confesses to Asa in the manuscript's chapter 12. Asa says, "What you done?" And Hayes responds, "Shriveled up a child, shriveled up one ain't born yet." Beneath this, O'Connor handwrites in all capital letters, "The child in the chimney," referring to the first story that Sabbath tells, which makes its way into the final edition of the novel, of an unwanted child that is strangled by its mother and father and hung up in the chimney of their home. Another kind of trace between the manuscripts and the novel is a series of literary allusions that O'Connor removed, but which still exercise a kind of influence and testify to her imaginative state as she drafted the final novel. In two different manuscript chapters, chapter 3 and chapter 10, O'Connor includes references to stories included in Dante's Inferno. The first is that of Cerberus being fed, as a university building is likened to Cerberus as a guard of the underworld, and Hayes, like Dante or Virgil, flung his hand out as if he were throwing something and then ran the rest of the block. In the incident in chapter 10, Chin, a graduate student of psychology who appears as Hayes's roommate in his sister's apartment, as they descend the stairs in the boarding house, Chin says, "These stairs are like that descent in the Inferno where Guryodon helps out." O'Connor, ever in her words a very innocent speller, meant to refer to the monster Geryon, who in Canto 17 of the Inferno is described as the disgusting likeness of deceit, who had the features of an honest man, so kindly was the countenance of the skin, but the trunk down below was serpentine. The stairs that lead down into Tockenham are like those that lead down into the lower pits of Dante's hell, and one needs special assistance even to walk past the buildings unharmed. The menacing character of the city certainly remains in the published novel. It is a generally well-known fact, even if often unremarked, that as O'Connor finished the novel, she was living with the Fitzgerald family in Connecticut, and Robert Fitzgerald was at this time at work on his translation of Sophocles' Theban cycle, consisting of 3 plays, Oedipus Rex, Oedipus at Colonus, and Antigone, the first 2 of which O'Connor mentions by name in her letters. In a letter 2 years after Wise Blood was published, she responds to an English professor who had asked about the sources of her novel, that I don't know how to cure all the sourcitis, except to tell you, but I can discover a good many possible sources myself for Wise Blood. But I am often embarrassed to find out that I read the sources after I had written the book. I have one of those food chopper brains that nothing comes out of the way it went in. That notwithstanding, she continues to write, the Oedipus business comes closer to home. Of course, Hayes Motes is not an Oedipus figure, but there are the obvious resemblances. Anyway, all I can say is I did a lot of thinking about Oedipus. So much thinking, in fact, that he shows up by name in one of the drafts of chapter 10, when Enoch brings Hayes the new Jesus. And I quote here from the manuscript. Enoch's brain was not of much weight, so that when his blood failed, he was in danger of almost everything. And what could be worse than to become familiar, in a vulgar sense, with a mystery that one hasn't penetrated? It was a fault that Hazel Motes and Enoch Emery could both share with Oedipus the king, and pay for like he did, pursued by forces he let loose himself. All this was very far from Enoch's mind. End quote. Well, of course, O'Connor cut this from the published version. It shows that, as she said, Oedipus was very much on her mind. She had thought much about the Oedipus business as she concluded her writing of the novel, such that Hayes's final action of the novel should be conceived of as a kind of atonement we see Oedipus making in the second Theban play, Oedipus at Colonus. To conclude, I wanted to hint at the meaning of the end of my title, and this perhaps would be something that could come up in Q&A if anyone's interested, the necessity of modern political life, having already addressed, though briefly, how Waugh and O'Connor show its unreality. Wouldn't it be better, considering how man is alienated from the modern city, one might ask, to either upend the city as a whole, or else withdraw from it, attempt to live in the country according to an older sense of values? Both novels suggest that the only way out of modern political life and its unreality is through. Tony leaves England in search of a city, only to end up with a half-Englishman holding him at gunpoint, forcing him to read Dickens novels out loud over and over again, with the readers hoping that perhaps Tony learns about his failures from the half-Christian culture which encouraged him to commit those sins in the first place. Towards the end of the novel, Hayes seeks to leave the city before being rebuffed. He had earlier realized that even the countryside was no safe haven exactly, as Sabbath had hidden his car and made the rural locale an attempted seduction scene. Life is necessarily political, which means that Christians and others discontented with the unreality of modernity will have to endure it. But both novels also suggest possible means of this endurance. The end of A Handful of Dust, that many readers and critics forget, the very last chapter, consists of Tony's poor cousins, the Richard Lass, inheriting Hetton. While the family has to close up parts of the house and fire some of the household staff, which does suggest to many readers a kind of decline, they are able to live a good family life while economizing on expenses. Andrew Moran first opened my eyes to the careful steward that Richard Last is, and how he and his wife take care to ensure that their children will grow in virtue, as opposed to the neglect Tony and Brenda's son John Andrew suffers. By prioritizing their marriage and family life and the Christianity which supports the flourishing of both, the Richard Lasts are able to establish a small redoubt within modernity to raise a new generation, which will be formed according to reality and not the standards of the unreal city. Hayes's life of penitence, similarly, suggests that As much as his landlady, Mrs. Flood, thinks that nobody is a monk anymore or lives in a monkery, that the monastic life, where Christians seek to live for Jesus alone, offering their lives as silent holocausts amid the city of man, remains possible within modernity. Regardless of the chaos around us in the modern city, finding Christ remains possible in whichever vocation he calls us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alex, for that interesting talk. We really appreciate it. And we have plenty of time for questions or comments, conversation. If people want to either raise their hand, I can call on you, or just speak out, or you can also put a comment or question in the chat and I can read it out that way.
I think.
Can I just jump in? Yeah. Hey, Alex.
Hey.
So I'm thinking through this part that you were talking about at the end about this necessity of political life, which is of course an overarching theme of what you're doing, and trying to think about Hayes. And I haven't read Evelyn Waugh in ages, so I can't really speak to that part of it. But on the O'Connor side, and I'm thinking about like one of the first quotations that people think of when they think of wise blood, and no one with a good car needs to be justified, right?
Yeah.
And so thinking about sort of Hayes's path through the novel and what leads him finally to the isolation at Mrs. Blood's and the blinding. I'm first, right? So I'm talking my way into this question. I promise it'll be a question. So, and also just about the motif, the identity which you emphasized at the beginning of Hayes as a veteran returning from war, and this sort of clear kind of trope of displacement of the veteran returning from war. And so what I'm trying to put together in my head, and here's where the question is. I need help with this. I'm trying to put together with my head Hayes's displacement from political life, and his kind of displacement as within the sort of Christian motifs of the novel that you're talking about, in terms of his religious identity and his nihilism and his attempt to reject everything, right? Notably everything. But and so what I when the car goes off the cliff, after it's been set up as no one with a good car needs to be justified, I mean, Hayes is left as someone who needs to be justified, right? Maybe. I mean, you don't have to go that far. But so I'm just trying to put together this necessity of political life with what seems to me within the novel to be this sort of relentless kind of failure of everything that moves Hayes away from feeling like he's a part of creation, or a creature that needs justification, or one that lives within all of these things that he's trying to reject but fails to reject. And so I wonder if maybe these don't go together, but maybe you can put them together for me. How I see a necessity of, just to try to be parallel here, I clearly see a necessity within the novel of some kind of religious identity, such that every attempt to reject it fails. But the necessity of political life, how does Hayes, given how I'm characterizing Hayes's journey, which you can disagree with at every point, but how do you put that together with the necessity of political life? Are the same things that he's trying to reject and failing to reject in this sort of spiritual journey? Do you read them as also having a political valence, or do you find are they different? They're two different journeys where he's unable to assimilate politically, and also unable to reject, or failing in his attempts to reject kind of his spiritual place in the world?
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. Yeah, no, I think you're on the right track. I think those two things do belong together, right? I mean, I think right, an easy way of summing up kind of part of the whole of what I'm arguing is that politics begins at home, right? We can't, pretend that, well, politics is just, we go out and we vote sometimes, and then people argue on TV about things that a lot of us don't know about, right? Right, but politics is actually about, right, communities living together, and that starts with the family, and that starts with just people's daily interactions with each other. And I think that, I mean, this is something that that critics argue about a little bit with the end of this novel. Susan Srigley, in her book, I believe it's The Sacramental Art of Flannery O'Connor, basically makes the argument that Hayes isn't really a Christian at the end because he doesn't practice charity towards Mrs. Flood. And it's, I actually kind of took that on a little bit in, I published a long article about Mrs. Flood in the James Dickey Review. And I mean, I think he is actually charitable towards her. It's a weird kind of charity because he's a weird kind of guy, right? But I think that, there is a way in which he's showing her something that calls her beyond herself. And I think she recognizes that. She knows that he has this knowledge that she doesn't have. She's drawn to him even kind of despite herself. And I think that, even though he's not perfect in charity, I mean, he's not, completely a saint or anything by the end of the novel. I think there's clearly a growth in that part of his life, and that part is political, I think the other political part that he grows in, right, is in respect to, right, the city of God, which, is invisible, right? It's kind of, it stretches our kind of simply earthly idea of politics as kind of visible communities, right, that we can observe. But at least one of the ways I think that, is a valid interpretation of his line, there is no other city, is there is no other city than the city of God, right? That the city he's in right now is the realest one, which really, I think, shows a radical contrast from his earlier remarks when he was, before he blinds himself, when he's trying to seek another city to go preach the church without Christ. He just thinks, well, Tottenham was a bust, but I can make it in Melzi, or I can make it in Tula Falls, or whatever. But that's he completely turns around from that idea after he's blinded himself. And so I think accepting that the unseen community of the city of God has a kind of primacy over those earthly committees, but doesn't at the same time destroy those earthly committees, right? In the sense that Catholics teach that grace builds on and perfects rather than destroys nature, right? I think there's something going on both with his interactions with Mrs. Flood, which I think you can properly call political, and also with his penances.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, other people, comments, questions? Christine Flanagan just posted great stuff. Alex, thanks. Before she left.
Perfect.
Say, Alex, just a quick question.
Yeah, please.
The two quotes by our good friend Ralph C. Woods, were those from his book, the Christ Haunted South, or from some other article that he may have written?
Yeah, no, those are kind of a little obscure, so I'm glad you asked. It's from a review essay that he wrote of the Political Companion in a journal called Interpretation. So that's where that is. If you send me an email and remind you, I can send you the citation. I think it's definitely a really helpful review essay because right, Ralph publishes an essay in that book, but then in this long review essay goes on to comment on everybody else's essays, as well as kind of elaborate things of his own that he didn't fully write on. So
yeah, I'll definitely send you an email, and also in that email I'll put another request in. Bruce is aware of the paper I'm working on for the September conference, and I'm looking for a little bit of insight from Wise Blood. So I'll come to you with my request.
perfect. Glad to help.
Thank you. Thank you. Well done tonight.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question, Alex. Thanks
Yeah,
so
go for
much
it, Katie.
for the talk. I enjoyed that very much. So you mentioned early on, and I haven't done a critical search really on Wise Blood, that there wasn't much criticism on the novel itself, but it was more about the film, the John Huston film.
Mhm.
So that surprises me a little. you know, and then I'm also kind of curious about your thoughts about why, like, why has this novel been more resistant to criticism, literary criticism, than the short stories? And what's your assessment of the kind of allure of the film, if it, as it were?
Yeah, yeah. So just to clarify, I didn't mean to say that there wasn't very much criticism at all of the novel, but really that there's not much new after 2009.
Okay.
There's a lot of literary criticism on the novel early on. And, you know, for, I mean, really decades up until 2009, I think there's kind of a robust conversation about it. And then it sort of dies off. And I think in part of the reason why it's resistant is that we, in a way, sort of ran out of things to talk about, right? I mean, the thing that everyone was talking about was this question that Susan, you know, guest heads the symposium about, which is, right, what do we do with Hayes's blinding? Right? Is that conversion? Is it not? You know, from kind of, you know, like differing Christian perspectives, how do we understand what's going on here? Right. And I think once that conversation had happened, people said, okay, well, it seems like there have been different positions staked out, but there's not a whole lot else to do with the novel. At this point, you know, there hadn't been a kind of generativity about, well, okay, what else is focal to the novel? How else, you know, should we talk about it? You know, I think bringing the movie in, you know, there's a whole range of things you can do. And just talking about, well, okay, how does this adaptation work, right? You've got, I mean, the film in a way is an interpretation of the novel, and so because you have this large interpretation that people are suddenly able to kind of investigate in a new way, it generates some discussion. So I was actually happy to kind of be in conversation a little bit with Jessica Schnapp, who finished her doctorate a couple years ago at CUA, who also wrote on Wise Blood and A Handful of Dust. And it was funny because we kind of came to it at about the same time. And she really focused in her dissertation talking about Wise Blood, focusing on Enoch, on the role of Enoch, really noting particularly that, you know, a number of early critics said, well, why is this guy here? Right? Like, we want to, you know, Hayes is the main character. Where is Hayes during all of these Enoch chapters? Right. And I think she really kind of helps flesh out the purpose of Enoch in terms of the narrative structure of the novel, in terms of his purpose relating to Hayes. And that was something that really helped me in thinking about the other characters, because, you know, as I mentioned, I really started thinking about Sabbath, and the fact that Sabbath is a female storyteller in, you know, a novelist work who has a lot to say about storytelling. And it was kind of curious to me that just no one had really looked at that carefully. I've since found a couple other things. I mean, I had found at the time Sarah Gordon's discussion of Sabbath, especially Sabbath is contained in the manuscripts in her book, The Obedient Imagination. But there was also an article that I'm keen to kind of look over again in the O'Connor Review from 2009 that kind of dealt with Sabbath's story, the first one about, you know, the girl who's strangled. So there's a little bit more out there than I thought, but there's still a kind of open vistas, I think, of in terms of once you really get into the novel, there's a lot to talk about that hasn't been discussed.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks.
Say, Alex, this another quick question from Craig.
Mhm.
Have you had a chance to encounter at all some of the work done by a fellow whose name is David King? And Bruce may remember David. David is a professor at Kennesaw State in Atlanta, Georgia. He he's both a literature you know, critic, if you will, but also a movie critic. And he wrote in my opinion, a fairly good criticism of the movie. I had had a chance to read it before the Summer Institute, and if you, I don't know if you were there or not, when John Lance Bacon came over Zoom and talked about Wise Blood, and he really liked it. David King kind of blasted it. So I was just curious if you'd encountered David King's work on Wise Blood.
I haven't. I'd love to read some of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll track it down and shoot it your way.
Thanks.
So.
Yeah. I think film is one of those areas where there's a lot more to say about Wise Blood, and, you know, both in between the film of Wise Blood and the novel, but also in terms of how Wise Blood particularly has influenced kind of further film. I don't remember, I feel like I kind of skimmed a little bit, Bruce, at some point, the review to see if anyone had written on this, but the movie Three Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri, you know, it actually starts with one of the characters holding up a, you know, collection of O'Connor short stories. I think It's a Good Man's hard to find. And there's just the way that they're kind of investigating like the structure of narrative and how fully fleshed out characters should become, I think is actually really connected to Wise Blood. So that's definitely something that should be looked into at some point.
I was wondering if I could ask a question, Alex.
Yeah.
In your presentation, you talked a couple times about ways in which Flannery O'Connor, in her notes, had pointed to maybe like gave clues about the meaning of the text, like the child hanging in the chimney. While you were doing archival work, did you find that she did a lot of explanation? She gave a lot of explanations for her writings, or like, is there anything else you came across, or was she pretty cryptic even in what you found in the archive?
Yeah, I would say in general she was pretty cryptic. I think she tended, when she was revising things that she had typewritten, I mean, she'll make corrections, but she doesn't typically kind of like analyze her own work. You know, she says it at one point, I think it's in the note to the second edition of Wise Blood, that she's congenitally innocent of theory, right? And so I think she's not analyzing, like, you know, especially at that level, a lot of her work while she's writing, but there are occasional things. I mean, she'll just occasionally write notes, and there's very few, but the ones that are there are interesting. So for instance, I think I wrote this down because this happens very early. She writes, I think it's in one of the first couple chapters, she handwrites at the top of a page, just the phrase, or the sentence rather, there are hardly any sinners left. Right? And that never shows up in the novel. You know, it doesn't show up anywhere, but it's just like her thought when she was thinking about what she was writing. You know, so you get these things occasionally, right? There are hardly any sinners left. And you're like, what does that mean? Like, that's something we got to think about. There are also just some funny things. There's a page where, you know, she's sort of sketching some chickens, and she writes out the phrase, the goat screams at midnight. And you're like, what does that mean, Flannery? Like, I don't know. You're just taking a break. You're resting from the hard work of writing. You're just thinking of something goofy. I mean, like, you know, like, so one thing I really loved about doing this archival research is you find stuff like that and you realize, like, okay, she was a human being, you know? And if I think about the goofy things I do sometimes when I'm writing and I have to take a break, you know, I mean, she did things like that too. So there are the occasional comments that I think are illustrative of larger themes of the novel, but then there's just some fun things in the archives.
All right, anybody else? Yeah, a couple minutes. Well, join me in thanking Alex Taylor again for his wonderful talk. And please keep posted with all the O'Connor Institute events. We were delighted to be able to host Alex here this summer. We hope to bring another junior scholar next summer. We have an exciting year planned, and we hope to see some of you at the conference.
Thanks so much to everybody for coming.
Thanks all.
Thank you, Alex. Wonderful. All right. Take care, everybody.